Test 1, 2. Hey, so as I mentioned in my email, and as I suggested to a few of you, I want to, as we begin to insert kind of special topics, which are sort of listed at the bottom of the syllabus, I'm trying to choose an order of topics that's going to be particularly helpful for your project. And it seemed in discussing with several of the project groups that a number of the projects, maybe most of the projects, are involving looking at different scenarios. Like you've got a model that has some sort of baseline function that you're developing, whether it be a fish tank that's exhibiting some sort of healthy nitrogen cycle, whether it's an aquatic ecosystem adjacent to a forest that is exhibiting normal behavior and then is exposed to forest fire, whether it's a situation where there's some opioid dynamic within a community, and there are various interventions that come in. All of those, what all of those have in common is what you're looking at is, how does this particular model that we developed behave under a set of different circumstances that might alter internal dynamics and behavior. For instance, one might be asking the question, if a forest fire occurs, does the aquatic system exhibit some permanent disruption, or does it exhibit a disruption that it then adjusts for and achieves some new level of stability? Or, same sort of thing with the aquarium tank. If you exhibit some sort of management behavior, does it behave differently? And because it seemed like this was a common property of many of the models that folks are examining, I thought it would be useful to start with a pretty cool simulation model that isn't necessarily directly related to any of your models, but the way this model was set up as a sort of heuristic learning tool is to explore like various different scenarios. So I thought this one would be, given that a lot of projects seem to be going in this sort of direction, I thought this one would be a particularly good, approach to modeling to explore. And so I'm going to introduce what's known as the DaisyWorld model today, and I'll say a little bit more about what the heck the DaisyWorld model is in a moment. But I just want to say a little bit about next class too, and how next class will run, just so we're set up for that. So as you guys know, you're reviewing each other's proposals right now, giving each other feedback on your proposals. And what we're going to do at the start of next class is break into groups that have reviewed particular proposals, where you'll discuss your views on the proposal and then provide feedback. This is something I do in a number of different classes, but what it typically does is provide people with really useful feedback going into revisions to their modeling proposals. And I know a lot of you have been sort of shifting your thinking about exactly what you're doing as you go along, so I get that. And I believe, Justin, you sent out a note to your modeling evaluators that you were still working on your proposal. Is that right? Yeah. So we know that these are evolving, and feel free to reach out to people who have been assigned to review your proposal to give them a heads up if you wish. But normally the process of developing a project involves writing a proposal, getting feedback on the proposal, starting to execute on that. And in an ideal situation, sometimes, as is the case in this course, you actually have a chance to sort of revise your proposal after you've gotten this feedback and after you've started working on it. And that will be the case here as well. So yeah, I mean, you guys know this, but this is the list of both the projects that are taking place in this class. And I realize names are shifting a little bit. I've revised the model number 2 to reflect its new focus, modeling group number 2. But these are just shortcut names for now for what we're calling these things. But hopefully everyone knows what they're assigned, and your job is to, before the end of the day today, if you haven't already done so, I know some of you have already been actively reviewing these, is to provide some comments at the end of the proposal. There are instructions for how to do that in the modeling project description. And then again, tomorrow, we're going to get together in groups that have reviewed particular proposals and have kind of, not tomorrow, on Thursday, have a little session where we'll give each other feedback on those. And that's been super constructive in the past and in helping people think about their models. So any questions on where we are or where we're heading? Okay, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to do some modeling project conferences to give you a little bit more feedback. We did a little bit of that last class, and that was very useful. All right. So, like I say, the model I'm presenting today for us to look at is one that examines how biology might regulate ecological systems. So, I think inherently when we think about ecosystems, by definition, ecosystems are sort of the interaction between living and non-living components within some sort of a defined area. The term biotic regulation was introduced to sort of talk about how the biology of a system can actually exhibit important controls on the system. That is, biological interactions can exhibit controls over how a system behaves, or to put it another way, that the abiotic factors within a model do have some influence on biotic possibility. So obviously, if you are in a place where there's a very sterile soil, that's going to influence what can grow on it. If you're in a place that has a very sandy soil, that's going to have an influence on what can grow there. So we know that abiotic factors are very important in determining what kinds of biological organisms can come in and initially occupy a site. But the idea here is that the converse is true too. Once biology occupies a site, the biology actually exerts some control over the abiotic conditions. So, as a forest begins to mature, it creates shade, it changes the internal environment within that forest ecosystem. That shade affects rates of decomposition. On a global scale, forests not only sort of are dependent on receiving water from the atmosphere, but on a global scale, forests actually are transpiring. They're sending a lot of water up into the atmosphere. So, when you look at like tropical rainforests, for instance, the presence of tropical rainforests increases the amount of water going back into the atmosphere, which increases the amount of rain coming down. So we've come to understand that in biological systems, biology is not only affected by the abiotic environment, it also affects the biotic environment. So there's this feedback between the living organisms and the non-living environment. It's not a one-way, flow of information. And so kind of a key question that ecologists have been asking for not as long as you might think is, to what extent and by what mechanisms does biology self-regulate its own environment? That is, can the biological system living on a site or in a very large system like the globe as a whole, can the biology itself help to regulate and stabilize the ecological system? So that's like a pretty important question for ecologists. And can that self-regulation lead to stability in the face of changing external conditions. So can the biology actually stabilize the dynamics from this? Can the presence of the biology, the internal interactions, the feedback within the biology, can that actually serve to stabilize ecological systems? And if it does, then are there bounds on the extent to which it can stabilize the ecosystem? So there are a variety of terms that ecologists and systems-oriented people have used to sort of describe this kind of regulation. So some people refer to this as self-organizing systems, or the term self-organizing system is used to describe systems in which internal feedbacks govern the process by which the system develops. And it's more general than just biological systems, but it's a term used to describe the degree to which these sort of interactions between internal components are sort of guiding the direction of the development of that system. There's a term that's sometimes used in systems literature called cybernetics. Comes from the Greek term for oarsman, someone who is regulating how a boat is being steered. But cybernetic systems are a class of systems that exhibit self-regulation. Again, I was just sort of introducing this from very much the frame of ecology, where the term biotic regulation is often used. But going back further in the history of ecology, was an individual named Frederick Clements who sort of put forward this idea of ecosystems being kind of like big organisms. He called them superorganisms. The idea being that ecosystems were kind of like organisms in exhibiting self-regulating properties. That idea ended up being fairly roundly critiqued. And in fact, the term ecosystem came out of a debate between Frederick Clements and another ecologist, Arthur Tansley, who thought, yeah, they're systems, but they're kind of different from organisms. And it's kind of confusing to call them superorganisms. But way back near the turn of the century, there was a Russian scientist named Vladimir Vernadsky who put forward this notion that the whole biosphere is actually very organism-like. In fact, when we use the word biosphere, that's a word that was created by Vladimir Vernadsky to describe this notion of the Earth as a whole living system that has to be kind of understood as a whole living system that can exhibit self-regulation. And then kind of the individual in the last century who received a lot of notoriety for advancing this notion of the whole globe as kind of like an organismal-like self-regulating system is a guy named James Lovelock. How many of you have heard of James Lovelock? Okay, a couple of you have heard of James Lovelock. Yeah, he's anyone? What's the hypothesis associated with James Lovelock? It's called the Gaia hypothesis up there. So the Gaia hypothesis is this idea that the Earth is a self-regulating ecosystem. And I want to say a little bit more about Lovelock, because the model that we're going to explore and play around with a bit today is a model that sort of is used as a heuristic model for sort of exploring how it might be, or how we can demonstrate that the idea of a self-regulating system doesn't involve any kind of magic or gods or anything like that. It's actually pretty straight up to develop a simple model that demonstrates at least ways in which a biological system could be self-regulatory. So just to say a little bit about James Lovelock, and I should say that this idea is actually, the Gaia hypothesis is actually associated with two individuals, Lynn Margulis as well. Who does anyone know? Does the name Lynn Margulis ring any bells with anyone? Yes. What do you know about Lynn Margulis? Right. She's very famous for a theory of how eukaryotic cells developed. It's called endosymbiosis. This idea that the bacteria, a bacteria engulfed another bacteria, and the nucleus of a cell is sort of like the eukaryotic cells are basically this evolutionary remnant of one cell engulfing another cell. But she was also very important with James Lovelock in developing the Gaia hypothesis, this notion of Earth as self-regulatory system. But Lovelock's an interesting character. He was an atmospheric chemist. He actually has he's background in engineering. He actually developed a very important piece of technology called the electron capture detector, which is a kind of gas chromatograph. You don't need to remember what I'm telling you now. This is just some background on the guy. It's a kind of gas chromatograph which is used to measure the concentrations of different gases. And NASA hired him to help them look for life on other planets. So basically to develop equipment that you could put on spaceships that we could send into outer space, measure gas concentrations on other planets, and assess whether the gas concentrations provided evidence that there was life on those planets. So he was hired to do that, and he spent some time thinking about that, working for NASA. He ended up saying to NASA, you know, we don't actually need to send equipment to other planets because you can look at gases remotely through telescopes that look at electromagnetic radiation. And basically his conclusion was these other planets all seem to be at some sort of equilibrium based on the energy flow through them. And the fact that they seem to be at some sort of chemical equilibrium on these planets means that there couldn't be life, because if you're looking for life, life is going to push things far out of equilibrium. Anyway, that got him thinking about the nature of life and how this planet differs from other planets, why the gas concentrations are so different on this planet than they are on other planets. And it began getting him asking some questions. Why has the Earth's temperature remained in a relatively narrow band? I mean, we know that it's gone up and down. We've had little ice ages and that sort of thing. But how has it remained in a relatively narrow band for 3.6 billion years, in spite of the fact that the sun's energy has changed? And why has oxygen concentration on the Earth? Oxygen is a highly reactive gas. It doesn't sit around. You don't have oxygen on a planet unless the planet is very far from equilibrium, because oxygen tends to react with things. It oxidizes things. You know, that's how you get rust, as oxygen interacting with iron to form rust. So he's like, why do we have this very out of equilibrium oxygen that stays in a narrow band? Why do we have temperature on the Earth staying within a relatively narrow band? And the answer he came up with is the only way you can explain why we have gas concentrations that are so far out of equilibrium and are maintained at this sort of level. And the only reason you can explain the Earth maintaining itself in this narrow band of temperature in spite of changing forcing, the external forcing of the sun has changed, and yet the internal conditions have remained the same, is that somehow life must be self-regulating the planet. You know, that there's no other explanation for it. You can't explain what's going on in terms of just, you know, the chemistry of the Earth without life. Now, this was in sort of the early 70s, and most of the scientific community who bothered to pay any attention to Lovelock, I mean, you know, people recognize the guy's a genius. He's developed this this equipment that, you know, can measure gases in ways no one else can. He's a smart guy. But when he published this book, which he calls Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, most scientists looked at that and said, this guy's nuts. You know, the Earth is, you know, and I think part of it, frankly, had to do with the title, because Gaia is what? What is Gaia? Where does the name Gaia come from, Marie? Right, Greek Mother Earth God, that's Gaia. And I think a lot of people, a lot of scientists, frankly, probably didn't read the book and felt like this is absurd. You know, the Earth is not a self-regulatory system, and life is not controlling this. And the idea of, you know, calling it like Mother Earth, he's invoking some sort of sentient being as sort of this thing, and we know that's not true. There's no brain operating the Earth. and that sort of thing. He never actually made any claims that there was some sort of sentient being or anything like that. His argument was strictly that there's biogeochemical feedback between components that's leading to this stability. But at any rate, there was a lot of criticism about the idea that the Earth was somehow optimizing something. It doesn't have any set goals, so how can it optimize something? The idea that that must be some sort of sentience in his theory, which again, there was never any sentience in his theory. But the funny thing is that nowadays, 40 or 50 years after these ideas were first introduced, his ideas have become so much a part of just basic biogeochemical thinking that it's like no one thinks about this as the slightest bit radical anymore. It's just understood that, yeah, this is the way it works. Biology has a big influence on how the planet operates. So the ideas have basically, initially starting out being soundly rejected, have basically just become so background that it's not even really talked about very much. We all understand that that the biology of the Earth is sort of critically important in the overall energy flows and material cycles taking place on the Earth. It's just sort of background now. But at the time, he was sort of like a revolutionary in his thinking. But one of the sort of ways that that he and other people who were sort of interested in this idea sort of approached the critique that this is ridiculous, there's no brain, how can it self-regulate without a brain? One of the ways that they addressed that was by developing models. And I think you guys are familiar with it, like global scale models tend to be enormously sophisticated. People create what are called global circulation models, which model sections of the Earth in 3 dimensions. And usually, at least in the beginnings of the development of global circulation models, they treated biology as a pretty, oftentimes they called it green slime, because it was treated as a very basic element. Over the course of developing, these sophisticated intergovernmental panel on climate change models, the IPCC models that scientists who participate in IPCC use, they've got increasingly sophisticated, increasingly small scale, and increasingly good at predicting, Earth's climate patterns while incorporating lots of biology, because it's understood at this point, the biology is a crucial interactive factor in controlling these things. So again, today people make these very sophisticated models. His goal, though, or the goal of people who sort of adopted and were interested in this model, was a very different one. It wasn't to say, let's create a predictive model that allows us to sort of, address human influences on the planet. It was to say, can we create an incredibly simple model that demonstrates that it is possible for biology, for a biological system to regulate itself, and make it as simple as it possibly can be, not because this is the way the world really does work, but simply to demonstrate that it doesn't require a great deal of sophistication to create a model that exhibits this kind of biotic regulation. And the model that it really actually was less him and more this person named Watson, who sort of like pioneered this model. They decided to make a model that consisted of a planet that has nothing on it but daisies. And they called this model of the world DaisyWorld. Have any of you heard of DaisyWorld? No. Well, there are people out there who are obsessed with DaisyWorld. Shortly before I got this, I had accepted my job at Oberlin, but I hadn't started my job at Oberlin. I got the opportunity to participate in the World Congress of Ecology, which was that year being held in Florence, Italy, which was a pretty sweet gig to go over there. I didn't participate in I was presenting on something totally unrelated to this, but I sat in on a session which was completely devoted to DaisyWorld, and it kind of blew me away because these were professional ecologists who were spending significant fractions of their professional lives developing models of this fictitious planet called DaisyWorld. and exploring the implications of various interactions on this fictitious planet called DaisyWorld. It was kind of mind-blowing to see all these scientists focused on this, generating models of a fictitious planet called DaisyWorld. But as I've said before, I talked about this trade-off between generality and realism. If you want something that represents the real world in detail, generally, well, I shouldn't use the word generally here. What you need to do is add lots of detail to that model to get it to represent what goes on in the real world out there. Oftentimes, what we're really interested, though, is just demonstrating a basic principle. And that does not require, and that is, we're interested in broad generality, but we don't care much about realism. We don't care that there is no Daisy world. We just care, can we develop a model that shows that that biology could control the physics of the planet. And so that was their goal in creating Daisy World. And I'd say, as you guys focus on your modeling projects, which is kind of the main focus for the remainder of the course now, I think your tendency sometimes might be to get specific about a particular system, but I'd encourage you to focus more on general principles. If you're focused on addiction, let's create a model that sort of illustrates general principles of how it could work, rather than trying to say we're going to model a particular community's response to that. Great if we want to reference the communities that are experiencing these problems. But I think Daisy World is not a bad analog of the kinds of models that are great to develop as modeling projects. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about Daisy World and describe this world to you. So it's a heuristic model. It's not designed to model a particular world, since Daisy World doesn't exist. It's designed to teach people about biotic regulation. And what you have to do for this model is envision a world that has only 3 kinds of ground cover in it. And here's the way that works. You've got black daisies. And what do we know about black objects in general, the color black? What do we know about them? They soak up a lot of heat. So black, if light shines on something black, that black object absorbs a lot of heat. Another way of saying that, as sort of a way that sort of like, people interested in planets would talk about that, is they'd say it has a low albedo. Albedo you can think of as reflectivity, how much light it reflects. It has a low albedo. It absorbs a lot of light energy and converts it into heat. So these black daisies, they're very good at absorbing light energy and turning it into heat. So another ground cover within this system is white daisies, and white daisies have a high albedo. They reflect a lot of light back out, so they absorb less heat. So we've got these, only 2 organisms live on this planet, black daisies and white daisies. There's nothing else but black daisies and white daisies on this planet. There is bare ground as well. So a given area of ground could have white daisies, black daisies, bare ground, but they have some combination of those 3. Everything is occupied by one of those 3 ground covers: black daisies, white daisies, or bare ground. You guys with me so far? Okay, so we've got some simplifying assumptions in this model, which are always good to create a model that's as simple as it can be to do what needs to be done. And that is, the temperature of the planet is controlled by how much light is coming in, that is solar luminosity, how much solar radiation is coming into the planet, and the albedo of the planet, how much of that is reflected back out. And that's the way our Earth operates too. You have light energy coming into the sun. A lot of that light energy is just reflected out by cloud cover. If it makes it through the clouds and reaches the ground, different surfaces on the ground have different albedos. They have different degrees of absorption and reflection. And as you guys probably know, one of the positive feedbacks within the climate system is that as we melt all of this ice on the polar caps, that ice has a very high albedo. Most of the light hitting that ice bounces back out into space. As that ice turns into water, ice has a very high albedo, water has a very low albedo, so it's absorbing more light energy as we melt the ice, and that's a positive feedback because you have more heat, you're going to melt more ice, and then you're going to convert more of this area that had been reflective into areas that are much more absorptive. So, I'm just saying all these principles in the Daisy World model, they play out in our own system. It's just, this is a simpler version of it. But so one simplifying assumption is temperature of the planet is controlled by how much solar luminosity is coming in, and by the albedo, how much of that solar luminosity that comes in is absorbed versus what's reflected. Now, another key principle here, which is again perfectly legitimate. In this particular system, we're assuming that plant growth is controlled by temperature. So we're actually ignoring the effect of light on the plant growth. We're saying that the plants have an optimum temperature at which they grow, and if the ground is too hot, they're going to not do well, and if it's too cold, they're not going to do well. They've got an optimum temperature at which they grow. And so you've got this sort of mixture of you got light coming in. It's being, how much of it is absorbed is a function of what your ground covers are. The more black daisies you have, the more light you're absorbing. The more white daisies you have, the less light you're absorbing on the planet. And that temperature that's resulting from that absorption of light is influencing the growth of the black and white daisies on the planet. So here's more specifically how at least the baseline case of this model is set up. And like I say, we're going to download and open up a version of this model. And the model itself, the nice thing about models is you can vary all of these things as much as you want within models. You can create scenarios that vary these things. But in sort of the baseline case, you assume that black daisies reflect 25% of the light that hits them, and they absorb 75%. White daisies reflect, wait, am I getting that right? Black daisies absorb 75, did I say this right? They absorb 75% of the light energy hitting them, and they reflect 25%. White daisies reflect 75% of the light coming in and absorb 25% of that light. And convert it to heat energy. And then bare ground cover is right between the two. So you've got these, just based on ground cover, you've got different degrees of absorption and reflection. And it, like I say, it makes sense. It's black, it's going to absorb more light energy. It's only reflecting out 25%. White, more reflective, 75% is reflect, 25% absorb bare ground between those two. And the percent area of the planet covered by each of these ground covers varies. So because the percent land cover varies, the temperature of the planet is going to vary. And this is just the simple equation, which is very straight up, of how much, the average albedo, the average amount of reflectivity of the planet. It's going to be the percent of that land area covered by white daisies multiplied by 0.75, since they reflect 75% of the light coming in. Percent covered by black daisies by 25%, bare times 0.5%. So it's pretty straight up. So it's like, depending on what you got, how much of each of these you have on the planet, you're going to have a planet that reflects and absorbs different amounts of light energy. And the light energy absorbed is also going to be pretty straight up. It's the amount of light energy coming in times albedo, which is reflectivity, times 100 minus albedo. So if the planet is very reflective, if the planet was all white daisies, it would be 75% reflective, and only 25% of the light energy coming in would be absorbed. Whereas if it was all black daisies, what percent would be absorbed? What percent of the solar luminosity coming in would be absorbed if it was all black daisies? What? The percent that would be absorbed, 75% would be absorbed, correct? So it's pretty straight up. It's not complicated. It's just what it's like. Now, the temperature of this planet is going to vary, as one might expect, locally. If you happen to be, and you guys have all experienced this in your life, if you walk onto a part of a parking lot which is black asphalt, how does the temperature of that that area compare with an adjacent area that is maybe white cement? What would you experience in terms of a temperature change as you walked into this environment? I'm sure you guys have had this experience. Walk into a parking lot, black parking lot. What does it feel like? It's hot, right? It's hot. So that's like a local effect. So the point is, in this particular model, if you're in a bed of white daisies, your average temperature is 5% lower than, it's decreased by 5%. So it's just cooler in that white bed of daisies. If you're in a bed of black daisies, it's going to be elevated by 5 degrees Celsius, not degrees Celsius. So just, depending on where you are on the planet. So the daisies are experiencing slightly different environments, even though the planet as a whole might be a certain temperature. The localized temperature in a bed of black and white daisies is going to be distinct because of just that sort of heat island effect, if you will. So just you have a bed of white daisies. You've got relatively little energy being absorbed. You've got a bed of black daisies, and you've got a lot more energy being absorbed and converted into heat. So again, it's pretty straight up. So let's now actually talk a little bit more about like what the model looks like. Again, the goal, especially in a heuristic model like this, and I would encourage you to adopt this in your modeling strategy as you build your modeling projects. Keep things as simple as they possibly can be. One of the simple, if you're just doing a model that involves the growth of something, most things grow by first order growth. The more of that thing there is, just like our very first island population model, the more of that thing there is, the more they can grow. And so that's the way the white daisies and the black daisies were set up. So we're kind of looking at at a model of the white daisies here, but they grow, and as they're growing by first order growth, you can see the number of white daisies influencing their growth. But like I say, the one additional factor we're sort of considering in their growth is the temperature of their environment. And the temperature with which they're growing is going to affect how fast they grow. They've got some optimal temperature at which they grow fastest. And if it's cooler than that or warmer than that, they will grow at a slower rate. And the temperature is controlled by the amount of white daisies and the amount of black daisies. The more white daisies there are, the cooler the temperature, the more black daisies, the hotter the temperature. And, the amount of area occupied by white and black daisies is like, there's a total area occupied by daisies, which is what this variable is. So hopefully, and we've got simple first order loss as well. You've got a first order growth, which is temperature dependent, a first order loss, which is not temperature dependent. That temperature dependent is dependent on how much of the stock of each of these stocks is present, basically ground cover. So it's at its essence, it's a very, very simple model. And there's a sort of very simplified optimum temperature situation where an optimum is set at 22.5 degrees. So it will have maximum growth of 1 at a growth factor of 1 at 22.5 degrees Celsius, and it will go down as temperature goes above that or temperature goes below that. So that's basically what's in this temperature. Depending on temperature, it will select where you are in that growth curve. That's good. And basically, the equations and the coefficients for black and white daisies are absolutely identical. The only thing important to remember from what I said is that the temperature within a bed of black daisies is elevated by 5 degrees, and the temperature within a bed of white daisies is down by 5 degrees. So if the ambient temperature is above optimum, the white daisies might be actually at their optimum. If the ambient temperature is 5 degrees above 22.5, so if it's 27.5, actually for the white daisies, that's getting them at their optimal temperature because their bed is cooler than the rest of the planet. And similarly, if the temperature is below by 5 degrees, then black daisies would actually be at their optimum because they're absorbing more light energy. All right, so let's talk a little bit about feedbacks going on in this model. What kind of feedback there is within this very, very simple model. So we have a white daisy population, and this is first order growth, which means that if more white daisies lead to more white daisies, the larger the population, the faster they can grow. Just like most populations, they've got at least first order growth built into their system. There may be other things constraining what they're doing, but first order growth is sort of built into their feedback. So more daisies means the potential for more daisies. That's a positive feedback. There is first order death as well. So more daisies also means more daisy death, which again, typical of many populations. And so that's what kind of feedback? Yeah, that's a negative feedback. So they've got, and again, this was built into our first assignments models. Now, there's also an issue of space in this model. So the more white daisies there are, the less available their area there is to grow. And so as they grow, they're taking up space. And how's that likely to affect their growth rate? Before I put more on here, what kind of a feedback is that likely to be, that the more daisies there are, the less room there is for daisies to grow? How's that likely to impact them? So more daisies means less area available for daisies to grow. How's this likely to affect daisy growth? Yeah, it's going to be a negative effect because they're space limited, and so that's a negative feedback in there. So that's a piece of this puzzle, that they're occupying space, and as they do, they've got less space available to expand to. All right, so temperature, we've said temperature affects the growth rate. So we know we've got this temperature effect on growth rate, and we know we've got this localized temperature situation that's going to sort of influence our daisies. We also know that the daisies themselves, the amount of the white daisy population is affecting how reflective the planet is as a whole. So the more white daisies we have, the more reflective, the higher the albedo. So that's a thing. So, there's our energy coming into the planet as it switches to more white daisies. We're cooling the planet down, or we're reflecting more heat and therefore not absorbing as much energy. So we're effectively cooling it down. We've got solar luminosity coming in. So our absorbed light energy is a function of both the reflectivity of the planet and how much light is going into the planet. So how reflective it is and how much light is being delivered to it. So that's affecting our light energy. And that, light energy, the absorbed light energy, is controlling the temperature of the planet. And we've got the cooling near white. So like all of this is sort of like embodied in this very simple model here. Like all of these relationships are kind of embodied in that. We don't have the intensity in this model, but the intensity is the solar intensity falling on the planet is basically just an external forcing function that's acting on the planet. So, this is basically, this happens to be white daisies here, but the black daisies are very, very similar to the white daisies. And let me take you to the black daisy population. It's got all the same, basic biological feedbacks in that section. It's got the same temperature optimum. So most of this is the same as the white daisies, except they have a different influence on how much light is being absorbed by the planet. So they're having a different effect on light energy absorbing, and they've got sort of a local heating effect. So mostly it's the same model. It's just a little bit different, just very slight variations. So two really simple models, model of white daisies, model of black daisies, that we're joining together to create an overall model of the planet. They're both competing for space. So So the space available is a function of both the black and the white daisy population, but it's a pretty darn simple model. And what I want us to do now is actually open up this model. So if we go to the syllabus, you're going to find a right. Let's go down to today's class and click on self-organizing Gaia and Lovelock, and there'll be a link to download here for DaisyWorld version 5 model. And so you probably need to sort of let's see, need to click on that and then download that model and then open that model with me. And let me know if you're having any problems getting this thing open. Guys, with me, does everyone have it open or not yet? Yes, everyone's got it open. Okay, so basically what we're looking at here in the Stella model is a version of this DaisyWorld model. And again, at the top of this model, you can see white daisies and you can see black daisies. It looks a little bit more complicated. There are all these different connectors and everything. And those connectors are basically allowing us to create an interface for this model that allows people to interact with the model. So you see these weird things in here like white pruned and black pruned. And that's because this model was created so that you can allow the model to run on its own under various scenarios, but it also has introduced, we use the word gamification into the model, where the person playing with this model can interact with the model. And this is, obviously, as human beings, we have engaged with this planet, which has exhibited these self-regulatory behaviors for a long time. And we've sort of inserted ourselves into the regulation of the planet to the point in which most of the major biogeochemical cycles on Earth right now are in one way or another strongly influenced by, if not controlled by, human beings. And so we're already kind of the gardeners of this planet, not very intentional gardeners, maybe not doing a great job of cultivating our garden, but nevertheless, we're controlling these things. And so one of the things that the people who originated DaisyWorld wanted to do was to create a model in which human beings could intervene by going in and changing the number of daisies. So they could harvest a bunch of white daisies if it seemed like the planet was getting too cold, or they could harvest a bunch of black daisies. They could prune a bunch of black daisies if it seemed like the world was getting too hot. And so they created that as an element in this model that you could engage with. Oh, and also I'll point out down here, this is going to be useful for a lot of folks. One of the things they did was to develop a number of different scenarios for light energy entering the Earth. So you'll see solar 1, solar 2, solar 3, solar 4. These are different scenarios by which light, so different regimes of light hitting the planet. Some of them elevate light energy, so it's a higher light coming into the planet. Remember, Lovelock was sort of observing that the solar luminosity increased, the temperature remained the same. So they're asking that question, can you raise temperature? Or can you have cataclysmic events where the temperature, the light coming into the Earth suddenly changes to some different amount? How does this world of black and white daisies adjust to that? Does it stabilize? in those conditions. So these are basically different scenarios. But the reason I'm spending some time on this is I think many of you are going to want to use the very same techniques that are used in this model to construct your different scenarios. So just for a second, let's double click on solar luminosity. And what you're going to see is that there's basically a bunch of if statements there. And these if statements are creating different scenarios. And this is how you guys will want to create. If you want a user interface that someone can say, okay, well, what if there's a forest fire? What if there isn't? That can be a scenario. So forest fire or no forest fire could be a scenario. And you can see it's just if statement. Solar luminosity scenario equals 1, then solar 1. Else if solar luminosity scenario equals 2, then solar 2. Else solar 3. So it's basically just saying this is a scenario number here, and it will choose different solar luminosities. That's just the baseline case, a solar luminosity of 1. That's a solar luminosity that, check out this if statement. This is a solar luminosity that if time equals 2010, then 1.25 else 1, which is to say it's a model that in 2010 will bump up solar luminosity to 1.25 for 1 year, and then it will go back down again. So it's like this cataclysmic event, planetary event, in which suddenly the sun exhibited this excess energy. And you can look at how it affects. Anyway, so there are these different scenarios. We could look at them. This one is one where instead of heating up by 25% in 2010, it cooled down by 25% in 2010, and then went back to normal. So at any rate, you get a sense of how that works. Now here there's always, when you guys have been playing with Stella, always at the top here, there's been this sort of suite of tools that we simply have not touched. We haven't messed with them because for teaching people how to develop simulation models and build them and play with them, you don't really need those tools. But there are some really cool tools up there, and we're not going to go into so much how they're built today as how they're used. So I want to click on something that if you clicked on before wouldn't have done anything, but this little guy here which says open interface window. So click on that open interface window for a second. And normally if you were just building all the models you built and you clicked on that, there'd be nothing there because you haven't developed an interface for it yet. So this is just a really simple interface that was built for this model. And in fact, this is a model that I have now taken through several different iterations of Stella, and some of its functionality is actually not fully replaced because I haven't completely rebuilt it. Because every new version of Stella will wipe out your interface. So I'm only partway through rebuilding this interface, but it has everything in it we need to sort of get a sense of this model and how you can use interfaces. So when you're thinking about developing your modeling projects in this class, you definitely want to be thinking about an audience for your model. Who's this model for? And for many models, you might want to conceive of an audience that doesn't know anything about Stella, and it's not important that they know anything about Stella. You're simply trying to create a model that allows them to explore the implications of various different scenarios on some system that you've built. And so you can build an interface like this that allows other users to simply play with the interface, understand like the basic principles behind what's done, but they don't need to understand. They never need to even look at the Stella model we were just using. They could just simply interact with the interface. So one of the things that you will very often want in an interface is a button that basically has a bunch of text in it that describes how the model works, so that the interface is complete enough that someone can open the model, read the information inside your whatever your explanation button is called, and have an understanding of what it does. And so you can see this one sort of welcomes you to the world of Daisyworld and describes the various scenarios. So we just actually opened in Stella these different solar luminosity scenarios. And so you can see them kind of described here. So scenario one is just your baseline case. And for many of you, that's what you're going to want to focus the next couple of weeks on, is building a really solid baseline case, a model that exhibits some basic function to it under non-disturbed conditions. So that is where solar luminosity equals 1, and the daisies grow and they do their thing. Scenario number 2, as we looked at, is a heat shock scenario where in year 2010, luminosity jumps up to 1.25 and then goes back down again. And you're trying to see how can the system stabilize itself in response to that? Obviously, having it jump to 1.25 is going to increase the temperature a whole lot. That's probably going to really change the environment for these daisies. And so, they're going to have to respond to that. It's going to make it particularly hot among the black daisies. So presumably the black daisies might die off a little bit, probably going to be an advantage for white daisies in that heat. And so maybe they'll expand a little bit. Are they able to stabilize? And then this cold shock scenario here, where the incoming light intensity drops by 25%, goes down to 0.75. Presumably that's gonna help out black daisies, because it's warmer in a black daisy bed, and so maybe they grow and help the system recover. And the last scenario is a trend of sort of continuously increasing temperature up from 1 to 2 between 2010 and 2030. And alas, that's a model that has particular relevance to our current climate situation, where we are likely ramping up temperature, into the future as a result, and hoping that our ecosystems are going to be able to respond in a way that helps to self-regulate a little bit in response to that. So it's actually a remarkably relevant model, to simplified way, but relevant to thinking about some of the issues that we face. Okay. So a bunch of different controls inserted in here that one can adjust. These two dials here vary 2 different kinds of scenarios. The first one controls which of these light scenarios we're doing. So if this says 1, it means we're in a no crisis situation where we have constant temperature of 1, a luminosity of 1. But you can see, you can click on this. Oops, it's not going to work unless I go to the play mode. Right, so we're in edit mode right now. So if you click on anything right now, you can actually edit that thing and change the way it works. I could change the size of buttons. I could change the color of buttons. I could change what they control. So right now, I can basically grab anything and move it around, because I'm building the interface right now when I'm in this mode, building and editing the interface. So I can move things around, but that's not the mode we want to be in to actually work with the model. For that, we would want to go into play mode. And if we're in play mode, when you interact with it now, you're actually changing the scenario. So that's scenario 1. It's just a dial which allows you to control between these 4 different light intensity scenarios. So I've switched between each of them. I'll go back to 1 now. Now, you can do many things with these control panels. It's almost infinite what you can do in building one of these control panels. And as you'll discover, they're actually not very difficult to build. It's pretty straight up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I just want to, in today's class, give you a sense that this is something you can be thinking about and planning for as you build your model. So this is a possibility, like the different ways you might envision people interacting with their aquaria, different scenarios, so giving you a sense of what you can work towards here. Okay, so in this one on the right here is one that I have not fully fixed, I should say. It gives you different kinds of daisies. So I told you when I was sort of presenting the background on this about, sort of basically white daisies absorbing 25% of light, black daisies absorbing 75% of light, bare ground absorbing 50%. These scenarios here allow you to vary how much the white and the black daisies absorb. So you could spread that out. You can set them at whatever you want, and that's what this one on the right does. We're not going to play with that now, but just so you know what it is. Now these buttons here are just buttons that can do different things. This model is set up so that it actually runs for finite little blocks of time. So if I click the run for 2 years button, it's going to run for 2 years, and then it's going to stop and wait. And so that makes the model potentially interactive with your audience for the model, where you can run it for 2 years and then have them think about it and potentially engage in management activities like pruning black or white daisies. So it creates these modeling situations that can be interactive situations instead of just the model is going to run and do everything it's going to do. These take you to, if you click on these guys, they will take you to other pages within this. This particular page I just clicked on takes me to an interface where I can prune white daisies. I can make a prune request. So this would be to cut, to on a regular basis cut these white daisies. So this allows it to be interactive, and I can get back by clicking on these other pages. So I've just set it up to prune daisies. I think I might actually go back into this one and turn that off because I don't want to be pruning in my baseline. So I'm going to do no pruning. We'll start off with no intervention, but my point is these buttons will take you to other pages that allow you to do other things. This is just an output table here. It's just a display table. These guys are more or less just display dials that give you information about kind of where you are in the model, in behavior of the models, like speedometers or odometers. They're easy to just sort of generate and put on here. This model, like I say, one of the ways they gamify this is by allowing you to prune various things, so you could intervene, but they put a cost of pruning in there. They created a point system, and the point system is based on how far off you are from sort of optimal conditions for the plant. So if you're very far off, you're getting penalized with points, and if you prune, you lose points. So intervening in the system has costs to you, but it gives you a sense. Again, you could do almost an exact analog for the aquarium model here, if you wanted to, where you've got like a score that's telling you how good you're doing at maintaining nitrogen within the levels you want them to be maintained at within your aquarium. So it's got a pretty direct applicability. Again, why I thought this would be a cool model to start with. All right, let's go ahead and you can see where the initial conditions are in this model. The red dot that you see in this graph up here is the average temperature. The black line is the solar luminosity, and the green line is your score. So this is not even graphing daisies. These other ones actually graph the daisies, and these are actually bar graphs. Why is it not showing me that bar graph? I don't know. But this one is showing you my temperatures in different parts of the model, and this one is actually showing you how much black daisy area I have, white daisy area I have, and empty area. So presumably these are going to change over time. And if I click on the last one, this is going to be actually this is going to show me temperature near my daisies. So I could create any number of different graphs and pages in this model if I wanted to. But let's just go back to this one. So again, what we're actually looking at as we run this model is the temperature of the Earth and the cumulative score and the sunlight coming in. So let's go ahead and click run, and it's going to run for 2 years. And you can see immediately my average planetary temperature is going down. Because I'm running scenario 1, my solar luminosity is at 1, and presumably it's going to stay at 1 because it doesn't change in my first scenario. It's just constant the whole time. But let's go ahead and run it for another 2 years. And you can see my planetary temperature is dropping pretty rapidly. And I'm just clicking run for 2 years, and then it's stabilizing. And you can see it's achieving some sort of stable state. And so this is sort of my baseline condition where I started the planet with a certain solar luminosity. I started with a certain number of different kinds of daisies, and they changed in the beginning. So I had some white daisies and black daisies growing at differential rates. And eventually I achieved some stability. And because I achieved that stability, I'm earning more and more points as time goes on, because the system is behaving, it has self-regulated itself. It's maintaining its balance there. Everyone with me? All right, so let's try scenario 2. Scenario 2, remember, is a scenario where we've got a heat shock at year 110. So the planet is exposed to some sort of a astrological event, I guess, that causes the sun to suddenly flare and dump a lot of light on the adjacent planet on DaisyWorld. And let's see, I can stop the model because I haven't completely run it, and then I can click fresh start or start fresh, and it'll just clear out the modeling results there. Again, that's just, buttons can do many things, and one of the things they can do is clear your graph. So that button just cleared the graphs here. Okay, so let's run it for 2 years. Do we expect it to look any different from the model we just ran? Are you guys stuck? You're good. Oh, it did reset it, right? I don't know, right? Okay, so I need to put that back at 2. So make sure you guys are all running it at 2. Do we expect it to behave any differently if I run it under these circumstances during my first 2 years? No, because I start with 1. So let's run it for 2 years, and it doesn't look a whole lot different. Run it for another 2 years, and not surprisingly, it's so far looking very much like our previous model for the first 8 years, because that heat check was set up with an if statement that said, if year equals 2010, then 1.25 else 1. So it's 1 year when it's going to do its heat shock. So up until that, right before that 2010, it is behaving, it has basically pretty much stabilized temperature. It's doing what it's doing. But here we go. Let's run it into that time period, and you can see, boom, the temperature goes up significantly. My planetary average temperature has just jumped quite a bit, and you can see my score is taking a hit because I'm way outside the range of optimal conditions for my plant growth. So my score has suddenly plummeted. I've decreased my score because I'm so far out of the range of what is healthy for my plants. And but if I run it for another couple years and keep it running, what you're going to see is that the system manages to restabilize. Now, depending on the goals of your teaching goals in this sort of a model, you would probably want people taking a pretty close look at what's happening to the daisies in this situation. What do you think happened to the daisies when you increase solar luminosity by 25%? What do you think happened in terms of the selective pressures on your white and your black daisies under that particular event? Shantanu, what do you think? If I bump up temperature, what's that going to do to my white and my black daisies if I bump up my light intensity by 25%?
Like in terms of albedo?
Yeah, how's it going to affect my black and my white daisies and the competition between these guys?
Well, wouldn't the black daisies absorb more of the
Yeah, what's going to happen is the black daisies are absorbing lots of heat, and what's that going to do to them? Because they were not far from, I mean, we had just about reached a point where before we had that heat shock, we just about reached a point where the temperature was pretty stable on the planet when we bumped up the light intensity. So when you dump a lot of light on these black daisies, what's going to happen to the temperature in their immediate surroundings? Yeah, and what's that gonna do to their growth rate? It would decline, right? Because they're no longer in their optimum. They're like way above their optimum. Now, what is it going to do to the white daisy population? They're going to increase. And as white daisies increase and black daisies decrease, what's going to happen to the way in which the planet is absorbing energy? Justin, what's going to happen if I increase my white daisies and decrease my black daisies? What's going to happen to the amount of light I absorb? Immediately, like if I took this planet and I had a constant amount of light energy coming in, and I increase the amount of white daisies and I decrease the amount of black daisies, what would happen to the amount of heat energy absorbed? I've got a lot more white surface on the planet. How much of that is it going to absorb more or less of that incoming radiation? Less, exactly. So your first comment is right. It is basically adjusting so that it's going to decrease the amount of light it's absorbing by increasing the amount of white daisies, decreasing the amount of black daisies, because it's not at their, we've shifted the temperature around these daisies. And so the planet is basically able to shift its ground cover in a way that is going to stabilize its temperature. So initially, when you do the sudden 25% increase, it's absorbing much more heat energy. But because the biology is adjusting, white daisies increases, black daisies decreasing, it's ultimately rebalancing itself. So it's absorbing similar amounts of energy and therefore maintaining similar temperature. So it's, again, the whole concept of this model was to sort of explore and demonstrate the capacity of the system for self-regulation, and the model is designed to do that and does a good job of demonstrating that all you need to get a model to self-regulate is a very, very simple set of feedbacks within that system. That, again, there's no brain in these daisies. They're just responding to temperature based on a growth rate that is a function of how close they are to their optimal temperature. So let's try scenario 3. Scenario 3 is cold shock. So this is at 2010, the temperature is going to drop by 25% for 1 year, and then come back up. How do you think they're going to respond to this situation? Ari, what do you think? How are the black and the white daisies going to respond if you suddenly decrease light energy coming into the system? What's going to happen to the temperature of the planet if you suddenly decrease light intensity? It's going to go down. Yes. And how are the species going to respond? Our two species. Yeah. And you're saying, like, the words you put in there are some of why people criticize this. They're doing that to accomplish that. Actually, the daisies themselves are simply responding, but they're gonna end up doing that. They do not need sentience to make that decision. It's not really a decision. They're just simply passively responding to temperature, because that's the way the model is set up, where they just sort of like they're just growing according to their temperature optimum. So let's see if it does that. Let's stop the model and start fresh and move ourselves back to scenario 3. So we try that and run it, and not surprisingly, for the first 10 years, it's basically doing what it was doing in the first model. But here we expect to see this like drop in solar luminosity, which goes way down, because that's what we told the model to do. And again, the instant it does that, you're seeing a drop in points, because it's way outside of its optimum conditions. And then as we continue to run that, we see that system once again sort of finds a stable condition. Again, in spite of the fact that the temperature, that the light energy coming in remains low. So it's finding it's a different balance between black and white daisies, but it's nevertheless stabilizing itself. So it's a different balance of the biology has changed as a result of this change in external forcing, but it has nevertheless been able to regulate its conditions. All right, what I'm going to do for this next one is I don't want to run this. I want you guys to think about this final scenario is one in which the temperature increases continuously. If we go back to the model for a second and we double click on solar 4, you can kind of see in year 2010, it just begins ramping up temperature continuously. Instead of one big jump going up to some other temperature, it expands continuously up until, I guess this is probably 2030 or something. So from 2010 to 2030, it's just the light energy is getting more and more intense every year. It's just going up every year. You know, the thing's going to respond to this scenario. So what I'd like you to do is to talk through your expectations with your nearest neighbor about, now that you have some understanding of how this model works, what the feedbacks are, you know, imagine how this model is going to respond to this, predict behavior, and then try running the model so that you guys are actually thinking and talking about this. So again, I want you to predict how this might work with a scenario where we are ramping up our light intensity. Let's just go back to the model for a second. So it's ramping up from, actually it says in that, let's go back over here because it actually explains exactly what it's doing here. So this is one where it slowly climbed to between 2010 and 2030. So it ramps up from a light intensity of 1 to a light intensity of 2 during that 20-year period. It's just slowly ramping up. So yeah, have a conversation and go at it. You guys think you got it? Did it work the way you thought it?
Oh, we didn't.
Yeah.
We actually didn't run it.
Okay, we'll run it. That's the test.
Yeah. Eventually.
How'd it do? It did what you thought it would do. So why don't you guys try pruning and see if you can get it better if you actually intervene in the system. And the way you guys would prune. So run the model think through, talk through it. The way you would prune it is you'd go in here, and at each point you can select a certain amount of pruning that you might do. So see if you can increase your score by engaging in interacting. So this is human management within the system. To control dynamics. And like I say, as long as you're pruning, there's an expense to that. So it's taking away points, but it's adding points if you get it to stabilize while you're doing that. So there's a bit of a balance there. And you can prune either black or white daisies. You have your choice. This is sort of your pruning request that goes in here. Let's see who can get the highest score. So this is under scenario 5. You can engage in pruning. We'll have a little very friendly intergroup competition here. So we've got 3 groups here, and our goal is to have the highest score at the end of this by either engaging in pruning or not engaging in pruning. And you guys want to strategize with each other to think about how you could maximize that score. You can prune the black ones, I think. No, I guess maybe I never added that in. Like I say, I was sort of midway through revising this. So you can only prune, you can change the initial black area. Yeah, like I say, I haven't completely rebuilt this model yet. I had to rebuild the interface because it was toasted when it shifted models. All right, one more minute before we're going to compare scores. So we'll see who got the highest score.
Oh no, it's
Yeah, it will jump between scenarios if you're not paying attention to it. All right, one more minute.
What if we got like the worst for the fastest?
There's a heavy cost of pruning. Are you discovering that?
yes.
Yeah, there always is, because it's management. You know, it costs money and energy and maybe fossil fuels to manage the system. So you gotta. All right. Did anyone do better than the default scenario with their efforts? What was the score on the default number 5 scenario? -45. Did anyone do better than -45 with intervention? again, this is something I said early and have at the top of the sort of the instructions for modeling things. What you get when you build a model is a manifestation of the assumptions that go into it. And they built into this a very high cost of pruning. You could modify this model so that pruning was much more effective. I think from a heuristic standpoint, their goal was likely, based on the outcome of this model, to demonstrate you're far better off trying to maintain the natural regulatory properties of a planet than to try to intervene in the planet. So I think they had a certain axe to grind when they constructed this model, and one could modify the model if that's not quite where you wanted to go. But as with any model, what you see is a manifestation of what you built, of the assumptions in that. But to me, what's really cool about the model is at the baseline, how clearly it demonstrates that you can create this very, very simple model which demonstrates the self-regulatory properties. And if you can demonstrate something in a very simple system, obviously that same principle can operate in a much more complex system. It doesn't mean that it is operating in a complex system, although, like I say, pretty much everyone, absorbs and accepts most of Lovelock's concepts now. But the idea is you could demonstrate this does not require a God. It just requires, really simple interactions that we know are operating in ecosystems to get this kind of stability. But at a higher sort of meta level, my goal, the reason I wanted to put this model in front of you today is I think it really gives you some sense of where you might go with your modeling projects, or at least what opportunities you have if you want to create something that a user can interact with, the idea of different scenarios. And there's a lot of stuff we haven't played with at all, which is sort of built into the model, but hasn't been highlighted. For instance, this is the temperature optimum pattern. One thing you could do in this model is totally mess with that. I can just redraw a temperature optimum, and the model is now going to run with that temperature optimum. So there are many things, many ways in which this model, you could instruct someone to use this model. Like, you're going to get completely different outcomes now because I just changed the shape of the temperature optimum curve. So all of these things are sort of like doable in these models. And I think I wanted to reserve a little bit of time to check in with modeling groups to see where people are. I know you've been A, focused on developing your modeling proposal, and B, now focused on kind of reviewing other people's modeling proposals. But I'd like to at least do a quick circle with you before we close today and just check in with folks on where you are. So that's what I want to do, is sort of individually consult with. So if you get together with your modeling partner right now, I'm just gonna do a quick circle around, and when I'm not talking with you, just talk about where you are on your model, because we're gonna want to move pretty quickly from the conceptualizations and ideas you have towards actually putting together a conceptual model as quickly as possible, and then beginning to play with stuff. So I want to do a little bit of consulting with folks for the remainder of our time today. Unless anyone has anything to say about this. Was there anything else I wanted to say about this model? Let me just do a quick double check. No, just to say people did sort of a two-dimensional version of this model, DaisyWorld 2, as an expansion of that. But really, I just want to talk with the groups right now. So I think, is there a group that wants me to start with them? All right, I'll go in this order then. I'll check in on the aquarium first. I know it's just, that's fine. We can just chat about where you are. Okay, so this will just be really quick consult. Get together with your partner and just going to chat about where you are and where you want to be. Where are you guys?
Still just a little bit.
I just want to know if it's like any kind of things that you change.
All of the stuff figured out.
We need to look at your regular feedback.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Potentially you're putting an unused dose in there to start.
Are we still using?
So you're thinking of all of these stocks, is that the way you're conceptualizing?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the also.
Something like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm doing it, I was thinking about more.
Yeah. I feel like it'll be hard. Well, I'm like all those. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Probably the stuff that change all of your outside, so it'd be like a scenario in which you basically, if you put in, if you replace all of your causes of drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you just. People like are going through the front or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, but do the whole thing, serving it.
A lot of movement.
Yeah. But most I'm just not watching. I think it's not. I don't know, people are really modern, and then once you get that first one, it's about people, it's more flow into it. So, but then, I really like that. I like baby.
I'm sure some. Was a great book by
Yeah.
Have you heard of it? It's called. Yeah. He's the first person. Worldwide.
Yeah.
No, the one doesn't have these, and then,
Yeah.
basically models of ecosystems actually simulated always a lot. So it wouldn't be about just changing water. Simulated ecosystem. The whole thing.
Figure out exact numbers for damage.
Oh, yeah. And this is mentioned before, to me, like the numbers absolutely right. It's not you may think. We're most likely to get corrected, but don't have.
Yeah. Really did.
Right. Yeah, yeah, no, you should. You should. And that's why, that's like, it's got several different ways.
Yeah. Like the same like.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like especially for you guys, where you could envision making a model that would help someone in Western area understand what am I doing in life. Yeah. All right, cool. Where are you guys? Where? So where are you? What's your current conceptualization?
Based on that, like we're looking at like different second thing.
Because you.
Yeah. It's like this turn here, kind of good. Another one. Or something. Coming strong, like. I think that is like.
You want to harm the population? You seem to be building a model of from what I see here, I feel like you're more building a model right here. Yeah. The nutrients presumably are going to help these guys too. It's a matter of how much nutrients. I think it's actually kind of a cool idea to have a competition to be honest. And I said, what? I said, these guys are eating them. Why are they just, why don't one was like talking about how different policies affect like. These guys are eating them, right?
Yeah, I guess. But I guess like.
I think it's just funny that it might be possible to use too much. You know what I'm saying? It's,
Yeah.
I mean, you could have two populations. If you wanted to, that's, yeah. Yeah,
But like without it, but-
it's something I thought was moved on to my first. Actually got sort of. On the four levels, essentially, you've got your senior serious, you've got primary, consumer, secondary. What will be sort of the value of people realizing the same. I like the basic conceptualization. Did you guys get any further in finding different impacts of forest fires? Because you could do loading is one of them, but potentially there are other impacts. One or two on it.
We're still looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So that does. I just wondered if there's any other, because it would be kind of cool if there were like a couple of different. Like, I think ideally in that model you're looking at, there's like a couple of different impacts of forest fires or something different comfort levels, you know, so that you could like look at the layout of those, you know, maybe, like I say, maybe, yeah, that's a good, that's actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that I think could be a great angle where you're affecting nutrients, you're affecting sunlight. And maybe also, maybe also affecting temperature. I'm just thinking like a few different things that might affect different levels, you know? Like if you imagine, like in this model, that your fish have different temperature or one of your species. And in some ways, I think, here's my suggestion. This might actually be relevant for your model too, Art. You know, you're looking at a specific situation, but you're actually kind of looking for a generality in the sense of like, that's where I sort of started my conversation today, where it's like, if you find papers today, you can affect phosphorus, you can affect light, you can affect temperature. Now I think you have a lot of leeway to say, okay, we don't need to model a particular system. Again, this kind of gets into to where you guys were thinking about we're modeling disaster. We're sort of extracting these are a set of situations that that might be interactive within a model. And then building those feedbacks into your model. So you're saying we know that forest fires affect nutrients, it could affect temperature, it could affect light. Let's build an ecosystem model where different components are affected by phytoplankton. You're going to be affected both by the light and the nutrients, but maybe it's other trophic levels that are affected by the temperature. And you're kind of like basically building a model in which you can explore these three fire factors. And they're manipulated, you know, much like this model where you can do different scenarios. Or let's just work out.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just more temperature, and then let's let people vary them at the same time. So you're like, or be interactive with that. But it's still, as we had our conversation yesterday, you're still kind of looking at it as external forcing rather than feedback to fires. Yeah, but I guess like,
Like how we find.
I thought this is trying to say you can kind of like, once you get the basic idea of what these factors, I think you get like put a label on them and say, we need to know what the temperature actually is, and you can play and say, we know it's going to affect these things. We're doing it generally. It's easy model. We're looking at, like DaisyWorld looks at the effect of varying light intensity on the planet. The planet isn't real. The light variation isn't real. So you guys are really looking at potential forest fire effects, but you're not constraining yourself to say this needs to be an ecosystem that matches a real ecosystem. You're just saying we know that there are these relationships, ecosystems going out at forest fires. We have these things. Let's build towards those potential factors, isolation and then combination. The scenario. Where do you guys
Yeah.
Well,
Sure.
yeah, I feel like.
Yeah. But yeah.
do you have I have to get my hand ideas.
So we have. And then.
I'll be.
If people are.
Just let me know.
I'll be out.
Yeah.
We can try to shrink it. Unfortunately, it's supposed to work. And we're going to need one.
I don't talk about.
And then because we're. Those things help
You gotta figure out like, and I would.
just say like.
Yeah.
Things that impact how infrastructure invests.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why, which one of these top fair places.
Right.
Like.
Right.
Usually that, like. the most
Yeah.
Right. It's like something else. I'd be involved in showing how. different communities are doing.
Right, I guess the key question is what are stopping flows here? I mean, I'm understanding your piece. So vulnerability is kind of like a is that on what like it is a conceptual stop. You're thinking of like vulnerability as being a conceptual. Yeah, right. Okay. Stop.
But I guess that can also be like. I don't know that and trying to figure out how like this is a soft variable, like ability to rebuild could be like more variable, like if there's like literally like percentage of houses that are able to be like.
Right. I'm thinking of like one way to think about I'm just trying to think about ways of making this hard, like existing infrastructure money available for, I'm thinking about like.
Yeah, like even money and flood insurance, like for some people with flood insurance, those are both like hard variables, for example.
Right.
I think even like presence of hazardous land use.
Right.
Are hard variables.
Right.
I feel like. And you have to sort of like more vulnerability, ability to like overreact.
Yeah. Right. I think it's gonna be easier for mine to get my head wrapped around it once these are kind of like in a stellar conceptualization. So I can begin to think about like your conceptualization of the flows into like vulnerability and out of something like, I mean, just sort of getting a sense of like how are you seeing those increasing or decreasing as stocks, like the factors and what are the. Yes.
I don't know, but like, what would be the, like,
Right. 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 And I think I'm not ready to give you suggestions on that. That's how I have four out. And a lot of what you got.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I was actually not worried about that. Because this is really be a theoretical based on assumptions, so I mean, not that you should inform yourself by what the factors that might influence it, but in terms of like numbers, right? This is not going to be the numbers in this model, I think are not going to be. It's the one thing I am thinking, it's maybe one think of like what special topics we do next. Because it seems like this could be a model making sort of an ecological economics model. This is about like money flow and resources and stuff. So I think we do there is something in environmental economics model. I think something might be nice for us to do as a group. I might prioritize that because I think it's relevant to their model. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, yeah, like further along in understanding what you're doing before, I'm going to be very excited. How are you guys doing?
Yeah.
Good, yeah, I just feel like one of the things I was worried about when I first made my feedback, probably, I feel like it's too complicated. No, I don't know.
Okay, well, one thing I'm getting instantly from looking at this is it looks like this is a model of like a person. Yes, because I think that's something we'll distinguish. Are you modeling, or are you modeling group? You know,
This is like a population.
okay, so temporary sobriety then is like a group of, it's a top, okay.
Literally, sorry.
Okay, good. That's good. That's much easier, I think, to make it work like an up down.
Yeah.
I probably should assume we've got large bodies of people on each stop.
I just abbreviated.
Yeah.
I didn't want to.
No, that's totally fine. I just want to make sure. Okay, so, temporary sobriety, starting treatment, non-treated opioid addicted, readmitted. So there are people who are in, are there people, are there people treatment policies? I mean, I think it's a basic conceptualization. I think it's fine. I think it's a matter of getting specific in terms of, okay, have you guys tried running it out and stuff or not yet? Okay, because I think that's going to sort of, but these are basically groups. There's a group that's temporary. Right. 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 Yeah, I mean, I like it. I think it's one of those things where it's going to be sitting down and sort of like starting to build a model. It's going to make the things clear for all of us.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think so. All right, class is officially over.
Oh, no, you're good.
I'll try to look up more.
Yeah.
Stuff too. I can find out more stuff.
Okay.
When I just look at search and stuff
I just
too.
figured out.
I feel like we might need just more sources too. But for those who are formed for
Yeah.
All right, you guys take care.